These blocks represent the tonal scale of a print going from the highlights to the maximum density. If I were to break this apart, we can see how this is built up in layers. So this would be the first layer for the highlights. If I were to expose a Stouffer step wedge, which is just a silver negative with various densities on it, I'll get a chart that looks like this. You can see how the tone is white, 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 and then it ramps up a little bit in tone. So you can see that here, and then it just goes straight across. And here is just all completely exposed. If we were then to go to the second layer, so if we line these up, you can see how the first layer ramps up to here, and then the second one, I will expose it for less. Exposing it for less means the tone is going to shift. So if I were exposed it for the same amount of time, it'd look like this. But if I expose it for less, then this is going to line up with the first layer, and where the first layer ends, the second layer is going to start. So here we can see that with the Stouffer, where the first one ramps up in tone, ends, the second one is going to begin, and it'll ramp up in tone to here. And then we go on to a third layer. So again, we're going to control where this transition happens through the exposure time. So if I were to expose it for as long as the first layer, well, this isn't gonna, it doesn't line up well. If I expose it the same as the second layer, still doesn't line up well. I'm gonna expose it for less. So each time I'm about halving the exposure. So for the first one, let's say it was 100 units. The second one will be 50 units. Next one will be 25 units. And then finally, we'll do about 12 units. So you can see here, this might be the first layer, going to the second layer, going to the third layer, going to the fourth layer here. Each time I'm reducing the exposure time and increasing the amount of pigment. So we have two variables here. We are controlling where this transition happens through the exposure time. If we don't control this correctly, we are going to get banding in our print. So it's going to ramp up incorrectly. This might look something like this. So here, here, and this is going to fall over here. So we'll leave it like this. So here you can see the tone ramps up and then plateaus, ramps up, plateaus, ramps up, and then plateaus again. That's the same thing we're having here. It's ramping up, plateau, ramp up, plateau, ramp up, plateau. What we want is something look like this. Nice and even throughout the whole tonal scale. We're going to get that by controlling the exposure, but also controlling the concentration of the pigment. So if we were to, let's look at our first layer. This could be a medium concentration of pigment, but we could also do a lower concentration of pigment, or we could also dilute the PrintMaker's friend further. So a higher dilution will be very thin, so it'll give you a thinner layer. Or likewise, we could do a thicker layer and do something, or a high concentration of pigment, and we could get something like this, where it's going to ramp up really fast. So if we, for example, in the highlights, use too high of a concentration of pigment, and then in the shadows, use too low of a concentration of pigment, well, our print's going to have a very weird look. It's going to be very high concentration in the highlights, and then it's going to be very flat in the shadows. Other way around, if we, in our highlights, use too low of a concentration of pigment, and then in our shadows, something like this, use too high of a concentration of pigment, and goes a bit too far. Let's see. something like this, well, it might be kind of flat in the highlights and then it ramps up too fast. It's going to be very high contrast in the shadows. So we're controlling two things. One is the exposure time. Exposure time is telling us where that transition is going to happen. And then second is the concentration of the pigment. We want an even spacing of tone throughout the tonal scale. We could build up this tone in layers, as you know, coat the first layer, let's say like this. And okay. So let's say we coat the first layer here. When I coated that, you wouldn't see anything. This would just be a solid piece of tone. You wouldn't see anything, which is what we have here. It's not until you develop this where the unhardened PrintMaker's friend is going to wash away and the hardened PrintMaker's friend will stay on the page that we're going to see this, you know, the highlights washing out and then this ramp up in tone and then go over. So once we develop, we're going to see this. However, this structure of unhardened PrintMaker's friend over hardened PrintMaker's friend is still there. It exists. It's just we don't see it until we develop. So normally what people will do, or traditionally been done in gum printing, is develop and then you go onto your second layer. And so you'll coat a second layer on top of here and then put this in water, develop it out. So we got our second layer and then we have a third layer. You'll coat over the whole thing with gum and then develop it out and you'll get a third layer and so on and so forth. It's quite time consuming that way of coating and having to develop. In between, you're going to run into registration problems. When you coat the higher concentrations of pigment directly on the paper, you're going to get more staining. So we have a way to kind of fix all these problems by coating this. And then before we develop, like I said, the structure is still here. We still have unhardened PrintMaker's friend over hardened PrintMaker's friend. This structure is still here. Even though we can't see it, it's there. What we can then do is coat now a second layer on top of this without developing. So after we expose, we'll take it and we'll coat our second layer on there. And you can see that this structure, it exists. It's just we don't see it until we develop. So this would just look like a complete, you know, a little bit darker color here. So maybe something like this on our second layer. Going to our third layer here. We will coat, expose, and then one last layer, our fourth layer, we will coat the whole image and expose. And then when we develop, this structure is going to become visible. So this will all fall down like that, leaving a really nice tonal range in our print, going from nice highlights to blacks without banding if we've done all of our calculations correctly.